earned a master's course at Erasmus University on sustainability transitions, which later got turned into one called societal transitions, which the name change itself should show you that, you know, there's some uncomfortability with sustainability and even sustainability itself. What are we sustaining, for how long, for whom, right? What's going on? Maybe sustainability is just part of what we should be looking at. Maybe climate is just an outcome from a lot of unsustainability, right? Maybe if we look at our environment, what feels good to us, how to have trees everywhere, how to have rooms and that have windows, right? So we can enjoy fresh air and sunlight and have passive solar and all of that, passive heating. Maybe that is part of sustainability too. So I'm going to begin just with the story of a very, very famous woman. And Hidalgo has been transforming Paris. Has anybody heard of Hidalgo and her work? Yeah, so in 10 years, pollution in Paris went down by 40%. Now, Paris is one of the largest cities in Europe, and it went from, you know, this is a heat map of pollution, and you can see over the years, it got a lot cleaner. And the end effect of that is we're going to have tens of thousands of fewer asthma cases. We're going to have a lot of people who are going to have an easier time breathing. We're going to have less hospital visits and save a lot of money collectively for our medical programs in reduced healthcare costs. So a lot of these sustainability measures pay for themselves, right? And how did they do that? In 2014, Anne Hidalgo became mayor of Paris, and she set to create a more livable city, greener streets and cleaner air. Of course, she got tons of pushback from business leaders, drivers, political opponents, saying that her plans were unrealistic. But she persevered by coalition building. And so she managed to pedestrianize roads near hundreds of schools so kids can play. That means taking the cars off of those roads. She presided over the planting of more than 200,000 trees, and she made it so that there's way more bicycle lanes in Paris, and that you actually pay more for parking if you have a bigger park, right? So it makes sense, right? If I take up a bigger parking place, I should probably pay more than if I take up a smaller parking place. And so all of that was very, very difficult during the process. But afterwards, most people are quite happy. What you get when you create a city for people rather than cars is you have streets that are pedestrian streets. And you know how much businesses make if they happen to have their business on a pedestrian street that was previously with cars? They triple the amount of traffic and sales. So, and we've done this experiment in thousands of different places in, you know, dozens of countries, and people are always like, yeah, but it's not going to work here. And being in public health, I hear this all the time. Yeah, that might work in the Netherlands, you know, having bicycle lanes everywhere, but that's not going to work here. And yet, once you do it, it works. You get the same outcomes. You get the same outcomes when you have pedestrian zones. That the businesses make way more money. So they were resisting until they made more money. And then they quietly, you know, ate their humble pie. And, you know, maybe not publicly acknowledged that they're very grateful, but they won. So I'm curious, just so we can have a little conversation and start things off, what have you done at UBA? What's going on? What's like the pulse? What's the issue that's alive right now for you all? Could be different, many issues. But what's something, you know, because you're here today, it's a beautiful day, competition with the sun is difficult, but you're here, so yeah.
I'm the coordinator of a campaign called Plant-Based Universities.
Mm-hmm.
So we try to have a fully vegan campus, and we were I was part of setting up the food store we have now in the canteen that's selling vegan dishes from Europe.
Awesome. How's that going?
Really good. It's going really well. It's really successful.
Great. Is that subsidized by the university? So like the vegan?
No, we're like a
Okay.
non-profit organization, and so we also the €4 are covering all our costs basically,
Oh.
and also like everyone working at the stand are not just students, and that we also pay them.
That's great.
Yeah. And
Hey, that's sustainable, right?
Yeah, and if we start making money, we would also lower the prices, and also showing that hey, we can actually have food for also cheap and also vegan food and really nourishing meals. Yeah, and also for food waste, if we have food left, we always give it to homeless shelters because we don't want to waste food.
So full circle. You're not just selecting for vegan food at any cost. You're also realizing, wow, the food industry has this problem, and you know, there's some organizations, some places that where you can pick up food for cheap and all of that. So there's a lot of movement in that area with food waste, but there's also a lot of people who are not yet plugged in to those services, platforms, in order to make it easy to get it to those people who need it the most. So
Seeing the insides of the kitchen, how much food get wasted here every day on campus was kind of devastating. So.
yeah. Great, thank you for sharing. Any other issues that are hot issues or recent wins? Yeah?
Are we talking pure environmental stuff or anything?
Mainly, but
Okay.
what do you got?
Well, I would say the most prominent issue, over right now are the Palestine protests, mostly by a long shot. Because if this was because I've been here for 3 years, remember there was an occupation of the university for their ties with Shell, all that, and people fussy against it, lots of mobilization, protesting must cut the ties with environmental six and stuff, but since it's all kicked off in almost 2 years ago now, first 2023, then it's only been about this a lot of the time. Well, not only about it, but here you have protests, had the encampment last time, all the repression of the protests bring police and all that stuff, and also you feel like this has, harmed the environmental movement of the university as, first for the Green Office and the UVA as well, it's tied to the UVA, and trust with them is lacking,
Yeah.
to put it extremely nicely. So people don't really care about this anymore. It's mostly cut the ties, Palestine liberation,
Yeah.
all of this. So yeah, it is important and I care about it a lot. I wouldn't be here if I wasn't. But it really is kind of objective in the grand scheme of things, because it's really seen as sustainability goes with the UVA. It's an UVA proposition, therefore it's not really taken kindly by students. The same goes for the budget cuts, because the UVA was saying we fully support the protest for the budget cuts. We encourage students to go. We are now not going to make tutorials mandatory. Result, people don't really care about the budget cuts because after what happened in May last year.
That's a really interesting analysis. So if I could just reflect on that for a moment, it seems like, because my next question after what you have done is what processes you use, right? And it seems that you have realized that certain issues can suck the oxygen out of the room, right? There's only so much space that any of us have for keeping things on the map, right? And we could disagree about certain things, but let's take, to have something that, at least in some places, has been controversial, queer rights, trans rights. This is, for maybe some of us, it's okay, it's a no-brainer, let's just do that and move on. There's a lot of other things in the world. But that issue, because for whatever reason, in some spaces, it's been an issue, has taken up a lot of space, say, in the US, right? In fact, it was a major mobilizing factor for the alt-right to do what they're doing in the US right now. That's so interesting, because it's a seemingly not a big deal, no-brainer, you know, do unto others as you would have them do to you, you know, sort of biblical thing. You just, you know, or if you like freedom, okay, you let people do whatever they need to do in privacy of their own home, sort of thing. Or if somebody wants to hold hands, great, let them hold hands, you know. There's a lot of frames where you could say, okay, let's take the box and move on to like much more intractable problems, like, say, you know, big wars, right? Or the fact that our entire global economy is hurtling towards a future where everything breaks down. And, you know, commodity chains and food access will be very, very different from what we have experienced as the norm, and we don't know anything different. And so we see with some of these processes that as we get a lot of resistance, say from the university, we're like, okay, so this is the place where we need to push on. But when the university is saying, budget cuts, please, we will hand out sandwiches, you know, for you to protest, people are like, wait a minute, so you're going to tear gas us for this issue, but you're going to make our life super easy if we support budget cuts. There's something going on here. And so you're telling us what sort of protest is going to be allowed, you know, vis-a-vis the official administration of the university. And that never feels good, right? When you're told what sort of protest is the good protest and what's the bad. And at the same time, when we hit a wall on so many things, we have basically two options. We can either, well, three options. We can hit our head against that wall even more. We can try different tactics, or we can, for the time being, move on to something else, right? And so, unfortunately, with a lot of these movements, by hitting your head against the wall even more, it makes the wall stronger. And at Erasmus University, where I work, we had a couple, sort of occupations of our university that I was also involved in. That were really generative in getting the administration to move forward, but then they started having diminishing returns, and there started being more sort of state violence, et cetera, et cetera. And so once you get that, you usually know, oh, we need to change our tactics. But a lot of people get upset because there's also emotions involved. There's identity, there's attachment. And so we double down and we create conflict, where it may not be generative for us, the other, but most of all, the thing we care about and why we're supposedly doing this is the issues that we want changed, right? So as important as it is what we're doing, and this is amazing with this beacon stand, you know, sounds like that's super well orchestrated and it's working. I'm also curious, what processes are we using so that we don't suck up all the oxygen from the ability to shine spotlights on the issues that also mean something to us, right? Because sustainability, if I just talked 24/7 about vegan campus, and I wrote a report on that for my university, and I've given countless presentations, you know, it's been a big part of what they asked me to do also. And I was like, okay, you're interested in doing this? Let's do it. Like, and let's keep you to your promise. At the same time, that's just one aspect of a sustainable university and the sort of playground that universities offer us, right? So we could ask, you know, what defines a sustainable university? Is it that all students are in touch with sustainability topics through their studies and extracurricular activities? Has everybody here taken a course that touches on sustainability in one way or another? So some of you are not raising your hands. I'm curious, like, what's your experience been?
Well, I study
Yeah.
And they're not really providing anything really, only if I choose a minor.
I see. So it's, you have to work harder to get that information.
Yeah.
Because I hope you all know, but finance is probably the most important aspect right now of sustainability or unsustainability. BlackRock, Vanguard, hedge funds, private equity firms, where they put their money, that's where development, growth, and everything happens. So I couldn't think of a more important area where sustainability plays a key role, even though most people would say, no. The standard role of sort of business administration, finance is you just do what you're supposed to do. But that's from 50, 100 years ago. That's from like the 1950s. And we don't really have that luxury of pretending that nothing has changed in these fields either in the last century. What about you?
I study business analytics.
Okay.
It's basically the same thing.
Okay, interesting. Because a colleague of mine, she's a professor of finance, and she is very interested in, how quarterly reports, for example, they promote unsustainability compared to when you could have a company where you could invest in longer term decisions, and you wouldn't get penalized for it, for making, say, a big investment that would pay off years later. But, your shareholders now can sue you. If, your quarterly returns, which are the current metric, don't measure up. And so we have companies that are trying to do the right thing with ESGs, SDGs, and their shareholders are suing them for lost return on investment. And that's a big problem because it's a big impediment to sustainability.
I'm studying political science, and it's not that we don't have sustainability related courses, but sometimes they're kind of hidden also in the way the course is framed.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember there was this one course called Sustainability Politics, which I didn't take because of other reasons, and I was like, oh, it sounds like what it says, right? Sustainability politics. And it actually was not at all about sustainability, in the sense that it was about how sustainable, in the very literal sense of the word, a policy can be, so like how the longevity of it, and like in that sense sustainable, which I thought was interesting. However, we keep talking about sustainability in terms of like intersectionality, so like like how the global warming affects disproportionately specific groups, and how that is tied to like colonialism or whatever. So it's also interesting that it's like, oh yeah, and there's sustainability. Like we have this, we have capitalism that sucks, we have racism that sucks. Oh yeah, and sustainability is also there.
It gets tacked on as sort of this other thing.
Yeah.
Yeah. And that's an interesting way, I would say, to I'll get into it later, but it's an interesting way for universities in the 21st century to comport themselves in this siloed way.
Yeah.
And that's, part of what isn't going to work for us going forward. And by not work, I'm not making an ethical argument. I'm making a jobs argument. I'm making a career advancement argument. I'm making a networking argument. I'm making an argument about how we need to work in a world that's changed. And I'll talk a little bit about that. So, sustainable university could also look at zero CO2 emissions through purchasing renewable energy, great, promoting public transport, insulating buildings. Basics. I think most universities in the Netherlands are going in that direction. That's sort of low-hanging fruit. Zero waste by maximizing recycling, composting leftover food, reusing water, purchasing cradle-to-cradle products, say getting rid of coffee cups that are disposable. That was a big fight at our university. Maximizing biodiversity by purchasing organic food, creating campus gardens, banning toxic chemicals. Right, so that's just like the baseline. But how do we get there? How do we infuse decision-making with sustainability? And here, I'm going to suggest that the framework of sociocracy can be really useful. Computer programmers have been using this for 40 years as a great way of how to work together in sort of clusters or cells, right? So you have circles. It's a peer governance system based on consent. And there's every reason why universities could have the president and the rector of the university also having a student that works well with them, professor who might have some insight on sustainability, a staff member, and have these circles of trusted teams of peers. Then you link these circles together to help them align. They're working on similar but different things. And then decision making is based on consent from the group. So basically, if you, another way of putting this, and if you've done organizing, you probably know affinity groups, this sort of thing. At least back when I was a student, back a long time ago, we had affinity groups where people who we felt comfortable with, where our nervous systems were happy around these people, we would be able to talk with each other, give genuine feedback to increase information flow. Because a lot of feedback nowadays is one way. We would like your evaluation on this. Evaluate your teachers. Like, how do you think the university is doing? And it's not real feedback because there's no feedback loop. You don't get to have a conversation. And so this is a form of decentralizing power and sharing information, which is very different from a lot of decision-making processes that are very bulky. They take a lot of time, they're slow, and unfortunately they don't work in many ways. So what does this look like? It looks at, you have a preference, we all have preferences, but then when you're working with people who you intrinsically trust, you can have a range of tolerance, right? So consent doesn't just mean my way or the highway. It means, what are the things that might not be my first preference, but I can see how somebody would come to that, and I can go with that. And then where's outside of that? So you have these groups, right? And you're working with these flows between the groups, and each group is based on trust. And so you might have different expertise that you're good at. You might have sort of different perspectives in different groups, but the groups can flow into each other. And so the notion of sociocracy is this notion that there is no hierarchy of knowledge necessarily, right? That different roles in the university may not be suited anymore to agile decision making. And we need to make better decisions in a more flexible way, right? You guys have heard of agile business or agile decision making before. Maybe this is something that's used a lot, like agile logistics, for example, where you can turn on a dime and do something different if, say, tariffs get placed on you. You're like, all right, now these guys are our trading partner. You have to be able to be more flexible than we were able to be in the past. But this also means that we have to dismantle some of the sort of, how do you say, the superstitions of superiority and inferiority that we had before. One way in which this works is through, in all decision making, especially important decisions, like if you're going to, make your campus more sustainable, or how to deal with students that are protesting, how to understand what they're saying and to not just ignore them as much as possible, right? That would be one way to look at it. You have a future generations commission, right? You have people who are in the decision-making sort of teams that have long-term thinking, and they're making long-term decisions, and they have a vote, right? Their vote matters. So Lithuania, Finland, and Wales, for example, in addition to Canada and other countries, have representatives in their parliament. When they're making major decisions, these are people who are supposed to think about 70 years or 7 generations into the future. This is a group of people wearing these special robes, right? You see these people wearing special robes here who are part of the Japanese Future Design Councils. Has anybody heard of future design before? Okay, so there's a really great book called The Good Ancestor. It has been a bestseller, and it studies these future design council movements. So let's say you have a community, let's say a university, where you're saying, okay, we have limited budget because the government just took away our budget. What are we going to spend our money on? And some people would say, oh, well, we need a new building. Others say education. And then you have certain people who, they go through a ceremony, they have a ritual, and they're meant to play the role of somebody 50 to 70 years into the future. So that's like what these special robes are about. They're supposed to internalize the perspective of long-term thinking. And from that perspective, they make very different decisions. Because it's not about them. We depersonalize for a moment all the strong emotions which we have about it, where it's like, I'm not going to let those students who are protesting get their way, or they don't know, they want sustainability, but things are much more complicated in the real world, whatever it may be. But when you depersonalize all the emotional baggage, which we're all carrying all the time, instead you're supposed to play a role, a ceremonial role of an ambassador from the future, thinking about the long-term outcomes. These people make different decisions. And when you bring them into a community and you give some of them, you deputize them with this role, and some of them not, the ones who have this role oftentimes can convince their peers to take different decisions because they're thinking over a different time span. Right? They're thinking about water, they're thinking about air, they're thinking about resources, they're thinking about what are the repercussions of the repercussions of the repercussions of what we're doing. And it's not just about quarterly returns. So these have been very successful methods of incorporating sustainability in all of its functions into decision making. And yes, it requires time. There's a Maasai saying that, if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. And this is exactly what we need. We need to go far. Because right now, breaking things and apologizing later, when we're dealing with catastrophic technologies such as AI, we're dealing with deep sea mining and huge energy decisions, this is going to have a lot of unintended consequences if we're sloppy about it, right? I come from California originally, where home of Silicon Valley, where we're taught to fail faster, right? Just make the mistake and move on. And yes, we all need a safe space to make mistakes because that's part of life. But there's a difference between making a mistake at a local level where you can learn on a personal level or with the group, and making a planetary-wide mistake. Those are very, very different, existential mistakes. And that's something that a lot of people don't have in mind right now. And when I talk about a lot of people, I'm talking about billionaires, heads of state, CEOs of the biggest companies on earth. I've met a lot of very rich, influential, important people, and I can tell you that there's nobody who's necessarily smarter, more informed, wiser than you. We're all sort of the blind leading the blind at this point, and we need to realize that nobody's coming to save us. There's no sort of like Star Wars, adventure. So we need to sort of save ourselves and take our future into our own hands. Now, an elder who I really appreciate her work, Rianne Eisler, she has looked at different types of organizing, different types of societies. One she calls more towards on a continuum, the domination-based societies, and one on partnership. And I think it's important for what we're doing to understand how this works. So domination systems are configured for family, economic, and social structures that are authoritarian, rank-based structures, rigid hierarchies, and dominations in family, economics, and society. You can see, does anybody know George Lakoff's work? So recently, Donald Trump was reelected. You had full-grown men saying, "Daddy's coming home," right? And so it was this notion of a father, an abusive father who hits his kids and gets them in line, right? That it's a Hobbesian view of the world, that we can only do the right thing when we have the fear of violence, right? That we can't just, do the right thing because we have mutual respect for each other, for example. That would be a different paradigm. And so we see from the domination system that the narratives and language, the gender roles and relations, and the structures are around unequals, right? I'm better, you're worse. And there are these sort of hierarchies of domination. Now, hierarchies can be very useful, but you have to know how to use them well. And that's why the partnership system configuration is based around a different structure, has more of a network, right? So rather than a hierarchy that's static, where I'm the breadwinner, I make the decisions, I set the rules, I control things. No, I might be better at this thing, so for these purposes, if we're going to do this, maybe I'm the manager. But then we go do something else, and I don't know how to do that at all. So then I get to be the learner. I get to be the mentee, right? The newcomer. And so we get to role switch on a regular basis. So none of these economic or power roles become ossified, solidified as that's who I am, how things are, and our relationship with each other, right? So it's a democratic structure and a hierarchy of actualization. So it's you get hierarchies to get things done. You get the thing done, then the hierarchy dissolves. That's the point here with partnership society. And these are ideal types, right? They're not 100% one or 100% the other. But understanding that there's other models, I think is really useful. Because especially your generation doesn't really enjoy domination models anymore. It's like not interesting anymore. And I think that other generations are still learning this. They don't know how to deal with that. They're like, what do you mean that like you can't be, like that you're going to actually do something unless you're scared or you have fear and all of this. So instead, we have in a partnership society of narrative and language, beliefs and stories present about empathy, mutually beneficial, nonviolent relations as normal, moral, and desirable. That we can achieve everything we want to get done without the threat of violence. And so a key concept here is ranking instead of linking, right? Instead of superior, inferior, we have hierarchies of actualization, power with, and power to. So instead of who's on top, our question is what's the quality of our connections? Is it a dog-eat-dog world, or is it one of creating mutual respect? And if you look at how China engages with business relations versus how, say, the typical U.S. way of, you make the deal and then you never want to work with that person again because they gave you such a bad deal, right? But you had to take the deal. China is looking 50, 100 years. They want to have long-term business relationships, right? So that's mutual respect. There's also this notion, when we talk about non-binary identities, we're not just talking about gender. We're also talking about, I'm not just a professor. I also am a musician, right? It's not this or that. I don't have to choose who I am to present to the world because, as Walt Whitman said, I contain multitudes. We are complex. We have lots of relationships. We're sons and daughters and friends and cousins, and we have these other relationships which also constitute us. And there's accountability and benefits which flow in all directions. So accountability is still there, but the benefits also flow in all the directions. So this is a very different model. So how do we achieve this? One, by measuring the value of care. Two, by making visible the connection between the devaluation of care and cycles of poverty. And we could say poverty for the environment as well. When we don't care about an ecosystem and we don't value it, then we think of it as expendable. It's not really necessary. Let's build the condominium complex. Three, by developing cohesive policies to support partnership families. So this isn't just nuclear families. This is also friendships, mentorships, etc. And then finally, by making the business case for the value of care, which is really important because you have to have an ROI. If your business isn't financially sustainable, it's not going to work. We have to create mechanisms so that we can have financial sustainability as well. So we're in a transition right now, and I know that y'all know that, but we need to help teach older generations what's going on. Whereas in the industrial era, we had the virtues of obedience, hierarchy, repetition, and conformity to work in a factory. In the knowledge service era, we're operating under different rules. The universe has changed, right? Creativity, teamwork, empathy, and diversity are important. There's a reason why Google values diversity, and it's not because of DEI. It's because of epistemology. We fundamentally all have blind spots. When we all come from different ways of seeing, different backgrounds, our blind spots are different. And we can inform each other of each other's blind spots, and thus, overall, we have fewer blind spots. And that's the goal. If you want to be future-proof, like my university aims to be, you need to have fewer blind spots. You need to really take the feedback from as many different perspectives as possible, and not just say, that's too much, I can't deal with it, I'm just going to do it my way. Right? I can't really listen to it right now, it's too much. And what do we need? A theory of change. We need a theory, this is from a colleague of mine's group, but you need a theory of change, just like we were talking about power analysis to understand the situation if you wish to change it. We need to look at what are our assumptions and stances, our core constituencies, our analysis of the root causes and influencing factors, a bigger picture, goal, impact, what will bring about the change, our niche or personal role in supporting the change, our core methods, and our core commitments. And these things could sound like a sort of like a business retreat, where, okay, you got to tick off the boxes. But really, if you're in the middle of a project, say, do you want Uva to become a vegan? It's really helpful to have a North Star. So when you're getting bogged down in all the details, to be able to say, okay, so getting back to this, how does this work? And to be able to iterate and reflect. Just going to quickly go through this, but you talked about intersectionality with sustainability, and one of the things I work on a lot is what's called the environmental determinants of health. So how environmental health addresses the physical, chemical, and biological factors in our world. And so that if we want to have health, mental health, physical health, etc., we need to ensure that we have healthy environments. And thus, the question of sustainability isn't just this tack on, nice to have. It is central and essential to quality of life, meaning, right? You can have all the money in the world on a dead planet, and you have nothing, right? You have all the money in the world, but if you're not nice and nobody actually likes you for who you are, your world is essentially over, right? There's no world for you. And so we need to find ways of taking care of our environment together, collectively, without overshoots, so that we can all have meaning, real health and wealth, and the whole diversity of types of wealth, not just economic wealth, which is predicated on ecological wealth. The moment we go over all of our tipping points, all the stock markets are going to go down. All the investments, all the jobs are going to dissipate. So we need to take care of our environment. This is from the Voxturm et al. Paper on planetary boundaries, which has been updated almost every year, that we are going beyond the boundaries in so many different ways. It's not just climate change or chemical pollution or nitrogen, stickstoff. It's so many different things all at once. Everything, everywhere, all at once. And what we get to a lot of the times is administrations a little bit nervous, a little bit paralyzed, not knowing how to proceed, using the same implement to do what they were doing before. And you get sustainability whack-a-mole. Have you ever played that game, like in an arcade, where you hit it here and it pops up there? That's what we're doing, and it's not really working. Every year, in the last, 35 years since we had the first IPCC report, emissions are just going up. We have emitted more carbon since the first IPCC report than in the entire history of humanity previous to the first IPCC report. None of the things we've done so far have slowed down our emissions. We keep on making excuses for our actions. Not very sustainable. And what my colleague David Abram suggests in The Spell of the Sensuous is that this is dangerous. Because how many people do you know who have mental health issues? Do you know anybody? Do you know anybody yet? It's pretty much everybody who knows somebody who has a very serious time with whatever they're dealing with. And so there's this notion that disease is often conceptualized as a kind of systemic imbalance within the sick person, right? We make it into individuals. It's your problem. Yet such destructive influences within the human community are commonly traceable to a disequilibrium between the community and the larger field of forces in which it's embedded. Only those persons who, by their everyday practice, are involved in monitoring and maintaining relations between the human village and the animate landscape are able to appropriately diagnose, treat, and ultimately relieve personal ailments and illnesses arising within the village. Any healer who was not simultaneously attending to the intertwined relations between the human community and the larger, more than human field would likely dispel an illness from one person only to have the same problem arise, perhaps in a new guise, a new form, somewhere else in the community. So we want to avoid passing disease around from one person to the next, right? Paying a lot of money for one person to get treated, only for the emissions of that to cause asthma to someone, Rotterdam's out or whatever it is. And so that's why if we have like a planetary health framework where we see our own health embedded in this planetary system, we can have a better notion of flourishing, which not only will actually create better health for us, but it'll actually make us feel more connected. And nature connectedness with others, is a huge part of our immune system and of our happiness. So Kate Raworth Who has seen the donut economics model before? Yeah, it's really, I think, a great visual because it shows us that we have so much freedom to operate in this green band, the safe space for humanity, to play, experiment, and do different ways of living, different styles of life. But we need to have a ecological ceiling and a social floor, right? So that my rights don't harm other people from their exercise of their rights. And so that my way of living my life doesn't harm the environment for me and other people. Right? So we get all these looping effects. So how do we do this? Well, to support universities transitioning, we need to think across many different categories. We need to think of these different ecosystems involved in thinking, teaching, doing, and engaging. And part of this is reconfiguring the university. As Laura and I talked about just before this, Nancy Fraser, this critical theorist, she has this notion that there are two different ways of understanding sort of restorative justice. How do we recognize the things that we weren't recognizing beforehand? So she has the example of gays, right? So previously, we had straight good, gay bad, or aberrant, or deviant. And so one method of dealing with that issue is to affirm the subordinated group and to say, yay for gay, right? But the group which gay is referring to is still straight. That's the sort of master signifier. So that's still the grandfathering in of a class of people into the category that you're not changing, right? So with the university, finance, right? You could say, yeah, maybe on the margins we can do some sustainability, but what we think about as finance isn't going to change. That is going to stay static. We can affirm sustainability, great, take your minor, go do that, good. But we're not actually going to change the category or the taxonomy or our concepts. The other way, Nancy Fraser suggests, is that we can transform our concepts and our categories. And instead of saying, okay, there's straight, and then these gay people over here that we're, yay, gonna lift up. Instead we say, maybe gay and straight are artificial designations, maybe this was one way of looking at it, but maybe there are other ways to look at it. Maybe there's queerness, and some people are more or less queer in different ways along many different spectra. Maybe this is what's going on, right? So that's transforming the categories rather than keeping one and just sort of elevating, say, yay, we love this subordinated group that we've been sexist or racist or whatever it is for a long time, right? That's one mode of decolonialism, right? Is what conservatives call reverse racism, things like that. But that's not, I think, what most people actually want. I think most people want to say, maybe these categories to begin with aren't really the only way of looking at things. And if we can look at things through different lenses, it'll make it a lot easier to reconceptualize what a university is and to actually have sustainability. Because if we don't do that, sustainability is always just going to be a tack on. It's always going to be an afterthought, and we're going to be playing whack-a-mole till, the world burns. So we need to create the conditions, spaces, incentives, and capacities for this transformation, for transdisciplinarity, to invest in new methods, tools, and practices, to think about what might it mean to do finance in the world today, and completely redo faculties, departments, majors, all of that in a different way, where we're talking about topics. And yes, you learn skills. We all need skills, but we don't just need technical skills. We also need soft skills. We also need topical skills. And this has to do with universities catching up with the real world. This is designing career paths, evaluations, and funding for impact and transition, facilitating institutional redesign and experimentation. So why would we do this? We would have system innovation projects. And again, none of this has to be expensive, which is the big fear of universities. Oh, it's going to cost so much money for a new program. No, a lot of our pre-existing programs aren't serving the needs that we actually need them to serve. We just need to compost a lot of our existing infrastructure into new forms. We need more composting and less new programs, new sort of initiatives. It would be a complete reorganization rather than attacking on. And this is something that administrators have a hard time with because they all have their pet projects that, you know, they are proud of this thing and maybe it's run its course, maybe it had its utility for a moment of time, maybe it's not really useful anymore. So, you know, there are different ways of looking at this. There's results-oriented, there's constructivist, and then there's reflexive, which means reflecting on how you're doing things, the methods, the outcomes, all of this, and maybe making new decisions. So it is sort of like a intellectual honesty that oftentimes when we, you know, think that we're wrong, we double down on what we do because it's such an uncomfortable feeling, right? To feel wrong, or to feel like, oops, I made a mistake. Or, yep, that program ran its course, and now maybe we free up the funds for something else. All of that takes an immense amount of personal power and courage, right? It takes so much more than we are trained or taught, or necessarily are training our leaders to do. So how do we put the prevailing values and institutional settings themselves up for discussion, right? So this is a very different framing of the issue. And one way to do this, if a university is serious about undertaking this, is through a program called reflexive monitoring in action. And so you look at, okay, we're not just creating mush here. We're not just creating something that doesn't have any notion of an outcome, or that it's all just going to be chaos, right? Because these are worries that, sure, legitimate worries. But the primary question is, do our project activities stimulate the learning processes for every aspect of the university, all the people involved, to result in the changes to the practices in the way that these practices are embedded in our institution? So it's really like cleaning it out from the inside out and saying, we have this thing called the university. We have buildings, we have people, we have these categories that we put them in. But those categories can change. The people have a lot of aspects of them that we're not fully maybe recognizing that could contribute to a more purpose-driven university. So how can we have this reflexivity and learning? And so the transformative university sustainability facilitates different knowledge logics, inter, and transdisciplinary, combines objective, descriptive, and engaged and explorative approaches and methods, empowers communities of academics to engage with desired futures. That's a future that not just like, okay, so I have no choice, I'm going to do this thing because like, hey, I need to have a livelihood for myself. No, what's the desirable future? If UVA could have a major role to play in not just accepting the budget cuts or saying, go protest students, but saying, we are going to completely transform what a university is and what it does, and sort of make the government come to us because it needs us more than we need them, right? How do we flip these frameworks and these logics around so that we're not always in this victim position? Because it gets really tiring, really old, and it doesn't work. It's not effective. So how do we create different types of funding, incentive settings, and organizational forms to accommodate the diversity of new forms of disciplines, capacities, and attitudes. All right, it's been a lot. I'm going to just get through this a little bit, and then we can have a discussion. So there's this really interesting book by Lena Rochelle Anderson called The Nordic Secret, a European story of beauty and freedom. What does that have to do with sustainability? She writes, as any serious educator or pedagogue knows, when you educate and when you work with people in general, when you work with inner development, you cannot predefine the outcome. So in that sense, there's a lot of creativity, there's a lot of freedom and beauty there. But for a system that's trying to create specific outcome, it can be scary or dangerous. You can only define the input. Trying to cram people into a predefined mold does not work, and it is unethical. So her focus in this book is on lifelong learning, personal development, and inner transformation through working together. And she has this notion of Bildung, which came out a couple hundred years ago from Germany, but spread throughout the Nordic countries. And it's this notion of the holistic development of individuals. So not just me as a professor of this thing or that, but me as part of a society that is interested in what comes next, where there is this sort of future orientation of openness, where we're not trying to say, okay, my position is just this. This is my career path, and that's all I should focus on. I should put on my blinders. That's the opposite of religion. It's the holistic development of individuals in harmony with society and nature. And it's not just academic. It integrates emotional, moral, and civic growth. So doing the things we care about are passion projects, as you'll learn as your life unfolds. Your passion projects sometimes might become your career. Right? Those things that you just do as a hobby that you really enjoy, they might be the things that you actually are really good at that are part of your ikigai, right? And everybody heard of this concept? So it's like what you're good at, what the world needs, what you enjoy doing, and what can provide you an income. And it's right at the center of that. That's your ikigai. Because if you just do something because you think it's going to be the safe option, but you really don't like it, you're going to burn out. You're not going to become interested after a while, and the costs are going to start piling up, and the benefits are going to start draining. Right? If you're doing something that you really love, you're really good at, but society won't pay you for it, also it's unsustainable. Right? You need to find this balance to have something that truly allows you to surf your life rather than to hate your life. Like, that's the opposite of Bildung. Hating your life, hating everything, hating the bird that's chirping and it's so intense. I know, but a lot of people have so much sadness because there's so much resentment for the decisions they didn't make. I just met with a student of mine who's a filmmaker. He says, in filmmaking, there's people who generally at the start of the film, in a script, you have your second identity. So people are living their sort of false life that they feel like they sort of got crammed into. And then the hero's journey of discovering who they are leads them into their authentic self. And Bildung says, no, you don't need to waste your life or half your life, have a midlife crisis or something before you live your authentic life. Let's figure out what makes you come alive. Right? And this approach of Bildung helps cultivate autonomous, responsible, and empathetic citizens, which created the Nordic welfare model, which means, hey, if you're on hard times, or you split from your partner, or you need to switch careers, there's social support, resources to help you switch directions, help you reconfigure, help you not become homeless, help you not become a drug addict, help you not do stupid things that are going to harm your society, right? Because these things are never going to help a society. So how can universities do Bildung? They can go beyond technical training and offer experiences in what it means to express, feel, cultivate, explore other facets and sides of you. So that you have some notion, okay, I like this, I don't like that. This I'm really attracted to, but I don't know how to do it. This thing is definitely an edge that I'd like to move into and feel into, but it's also scary. Right? This is emotional maturity. And this is sorely absent from the cultivation that happens in our universities. I once had a conversation with my rector, and I was talking about some of the ways in that students post-COVID were responding and needed extra support. And she said, yeah, but we're not a habeo. Like we can't, we can't train them to do useful things like with their hands, like here we only work with our minds. And it felt so jarring for me as a full person who I'm a musician. And I wouldn't be the type of academic I am if I weren't a musician. I also do other things with my hands. And they inform my ability to do my day job. They're not separate. Maybe these artificial distinctions are part of the problem, part of the unsustainabilities that we're getting ourselves into. So how can we encourage interdisciplinary learning and ecological literacy? Bildung can help us create space for personal reflection, collective dialogue, and values-based education. And foster agency, moral imagination, so that y'all don't just accept the parameters of the jobs that have been set out for you, but that you can actually be change makers, entrepreneurs, and empire builders of empires that serve rather than steal. And the deliberate cultivation of finding this sense of self aligned with collective flourishing. And a shift from universities as centers of career preparation, right, that's a passive role, to spaces for deep personal and ecological transformation. And we do this via reorienting curricula and culture, because we're culture creators here. UVA plays a big role in the culture of Amsterdam. Whether we like it or not, whether we accept that or not, it happens, it is. Reorienting curricula and culture around relationality, interdependence, and ecological humility. And like the folk high schools in the Nordic countries that operate according to Bildung principles, promoting holistic context-aware learning. So why are you learning this? Why? Hands-on work, echoing what we now call systems thinking. So part of this is letting between spaces grow. And I love this analogy of verge, biodiverse verge management. These are the roadside strips, the street buffers, the planting strips, between, say, a street and, say, the field or the building. And in the Netherlands, they found that 60% of all indigenous plant species in the Netherlands are found in the roadside verges. There's also this cool phenomenon of tegel dipping. Has anybody heard of that? It's like a thing. It's a months-long contest every year occurring in this country since 2021, where residents remove as many tegels or paving slabs from their gardens and from community spaces as possible, public spaces. It was a sort of competition dreamt up by the creative agency Frank Lee to encourage the greening and rewilding of urban spaces. And it's now considered a national sport, where large swaths of gray concrete are replaced by trees, grass, and vegetable plots every year. So this is, you could say, using our competitive edge for ecological fun, right, with your community. You see, like, okay, there's this strip here, it's doing nothing, it's serving nobody. let's plant some roses, or let's plant a community garden, or let's plant some trees. You take up the tables from the street, and you know, there's pictures, you can find it online, of people like stacking up high, and like, you know, how many tables did we take up? And I think it's cool because it's reclaiming wild aesthetics. It's re-understanding our sense of what are cities for, and what are our urban environments for, and how do we become comfortable with weeds. So, for example, many universities, like Utrecht and Rotterdam, they are only mowing these verges like twice a year, which they probably don't even need to do that. But before, they were mowing these places like 20 times a year. And what was that doing? It was killing all the insects, just making it so the birds had less food and there was less biodiversity. And so these are baby steps, but they're baby steps in the right direction. You know, I think they could just let them go. There's no need to mow them at all. And then actually you get succession and complex ecosystems that will grow up there. But mowing them 10 times less than they were before, that's still a win. You get more biodiversity, and it's good. Less, how do you say, CO2 gets released as well. Redefining our notions of chaos and order are also necessary. So, letting things grow organically. How do we get out of the way of life? You know, a lot of, especially at universities, like a lot of businesses, the pressure is we need to be doing more faster, right? As a professor, I need to publish more and higher impact journals and more publications. And it's just this addiction to never having enough. It's insufficiency at the basis of it. And finding what is enough allows us to come from a much more secure place. Not anxious, not avoidant, but secure. So what actors are already creating new ecological structures and opportunities? What student groups, for example? And how do we get out of the way? How do we train our university administrators to get out of the way of blocking ecological change and sustainability initiatives that are already happening, already being proposed? How do we help our bureaucracies become more agile? And so from lock-in to leapfrogging, transforming our university system from siloed departments to, you could say, flexible curriculum to, you know, probably in Amsterdam, car-centric commuting is not as big of a thing, but in Rotterdam, a lot of students still drive their cars. I'm like, all right, you know, if you live super far out there, I guess I get it. But I live in Zutphen, and I bike to the train station, and I take the train, and it works like a charm. And it's also, thankfully, subsidized by my university. So that makes it easy financially for me to be like, oh yeah, that's the best option. And instead of, you know, fossil fuel travel research, because there's also this huge, pressure for academics to attend every conference you could possibly attend, because it's all about shaking hands and kissing babies and networking. And, you know, we're basically like little mini politicians, like trying to create careers. You know, in my experience, it's not how my career has developed. And I have very good relations with universities and people I work with all over the world. But it doesn't necessarily require that I'm traveling around for 3 days here, 2 days there, to the other side of the planet. Not very sustainable. So how can we work towards regenerative campuses, digital and low impact travel? And when I do travel, I try to stay for as long as I can and really soak in, become part of the soup of that university, that culture, you know, because, you know, breathe in the bacteria which are there, you know, in the room. And instead of these rigid hierarchies of the administration is trying to hold back the heathen students from dismantling these august, you know, traditions, to distributed leadership like sociocracy and holocracy, like we spoke about at the beginning. And one way we can do this is stop building new buildings. But when we do, to do more with less, to have energy neutral buildings with passive cooling and heating and windows. And while these types of buildings are more expensive to build at the beginning, over the lifetime of the building, they pay for themselves many times over. So yeah, there are many different ways in which this operates. The new Langenfeld building at my university, Erasmus University Potsdam, has this, it takes rainwater and it has passive heating and cooling in the building. And so it basically doesn't require energy to heat and cool it. It has a lot of windows, though not in every room. But they have glass between the rooms, so you still get that passive sunlight. And I think that this is really the way that universities can do it, because we have the resources to invest, and we also can keep the building for a long time, so we can recoup all the return on investment. So with some of the work I've done at Erasmus on our Bildung campus, which our vice president said she wanted to get by 2030, I did some research and I looked and found that many universities around the world are doing a lot already. So we don't need to reinvent the wheel. There's Goldsmiths University of London banned beef in 2019 to drive out carbon use. Right? They want to reduce carbon emissions. Cambridge University, no slouch. They removed beef and lamb from their menus and are pushing plant-based options, and that achieved a 10.5% reduction in food-related emissions from their university, which I think is a major win. France, at least once a week, they're having meat-free meals, and many other universities as well. One of the parliamentarians in France, Barbara Pompili, said, "Reduction in meat is a step forward for young people's health." So it's not just about sustainability for the environment, it's also for helping people not be as heavy during their classes and exams and all of that, in terms of, if I eat a very heavy meal, I'm going to be more sleepy, for sure. And so there's also these knock-on effects that happen. And so I'm just going to end here with a parable from an experiment in the 1980s called Rat Park. And in Rat Park, typically we have in research, drug research with rats, you have them in their individual cages, right? And so they're giving them opium, morphine, heroin, heavy drugs. And then they said, okay, so when they have the choice between water and methadone or opium, they're going for the opium as their case. When they're in their little cages alone, no contact with other rats, nothing to do. There's no fun. And then they would take these rats and they put them in like a rat Disneyland with a bunch of other rats, fun stuff to do, little tubes to crawl through. It was communal. And they had never done an experiment with these rats together before. It had always been, what's the effect of this drug on these individual rats in their individual cages? And when they were in the rat park, they found that these rats were willing to go through withdrawal from the most addictive substance on earth, taking water instead of the opium-laced water, so that they could be more social with each other, so that they could be pro-social and engaged and have fun and play with the other rats because they had the opportunity to play. And this research shows that when people are in community, a lot of the problems that we focus so much of our time and effort and funding and money on go away when we properly recognize people, have a place for them in our community, make people useful because we value them, regardless of their achievement level or whatever other metric. We create a tribe and we include them and we interact and we do things together for a larger purpose, right? We are in service to something larger beyond ourselves together. And so this is this notion of multi-solving for mental health, environment, climate, sustainability, and learning by creating community together. And there's this book by Laura called Tiny Experiments. And I think we can have these tiny experiments at universities, because universities are the perfect laboratories for experiments like pricing carbon rationally, going meat-free, experimenting with mental health care, minimizing new unsustainable research or contracts, cutting ties with fossil fuel companies. These are not things that are going to stop the biggest problems, but they're tiny experiments that are all doable. Universities can cut ties with fossil fuel companies. That's not a big ask. It's an experiment. And when we think of them as tiny experiments, instead of, oh my God, Shell's going to hate us, and then we won't get financing, and then I won't get invited to that dinner party, which, let's be honest, administrator concerns, right? When we think about it instead as a tiny experiment, and distribute the agency, then no administrator is going to be responsible for it, and so they can't get blamed for doing good things, right? Because that's part of why we distribute responsibility most of the time. When we say, the university decided this, and you're like, who? I want to know, who decided this? But you can also use that for good, not just for bad, as is typically done, right? And so we can focus on our circle of control as universities. We don't need to, delude ourselves into thinking that we can solve foreign policy just through our single university, but we can control our university here. We have influence on how our university behaves, because we are the university. And so we can move from the ivory tower to living systems and think of the university as a catalyst for a thrivable future. And imagining the university as cultivating ecological wisdom, shared leadership, and systemic change. That's it. Thank you very much. I'd love to hear any questions, comments, any insights.
There was a slide about grouping, or I don't know, the thing about being happy.
Yep.
Yeah, it's called grouping.
I'm not sure.
But about that then, let's say, my first question was, why would we only let universities, or why would we start with universities and not with teaching kids to be happy or through the Bildung in kindergarten, for example?
Yeah, Bildung.
Oh, Bildung, yeah.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, no, absolutely. It was integrated through all schooling and through, education, with parents as well, the sort of informal ways in which we are all learning from each other. And it was in stories, novels, and paintings, and theater. Now we would say the equivalent would be like social media and Netflix videos and stuff like that. So Bildung, absolutely, it doesn't have to, or shouldn't just start at the university, but where are we right now? Right? There are people at this university who are training to become teachers, right? Early childhood teachers. So these are also people who we could interface with. I think the best place to start is wherever you're at. Start everywhere. But universities are good places to pattern interrupt, because we come here with whatever frameworks, ideologies that we inherited through our schooling, through our parents, through our culture, right? What we call the matrix society, like in psychedelics, right? We talk about substance, set, mindset, the setting, this room, and the matrix, the culture that you're brought up in. I just gave a talk at Albert on Saturday on ecodelics, so the ecological influences on psychedelics. So psychedelics aren't about the psyche, it's about the ecologies. And matrix is a big part. So universities are really great places, and college is a really good time in your life to be able to reflect on everything you inherited. To be like, okay, there's path dependency, but now I'm at a age of consent. I'm an adult. Do I consent to everything that I inherited? What things do I have questions about? What things do I have issues with? What things do I reject? And if I'm going to reject them, what am I going to accept in their place? So I agree. We need to start as young as possible with a notion of nature connectedness and curiosity and exploration. But universities are great places to do this pattern interrupt and take an inventory of what do we take to be the most important virtues that we want to further develop in our lives.
How would you make sure that the teachers teaching these virtues are qualified for this? Because they're basically going to be the face of the future for these kids. So it's not really like you get a grade for being so honest. You can't put a number on a virtue, I guess. Yeah. How would we go about that?
Yeah, good question. So obviously there's this question about teaching styles and what we're selecting for. Because when we're giving grades, we're selecting for a certain sort of performance, and we're rewarding certain sorts of performance over others. And usually the metrics of what we're rewarding are not as wide as the virtues that we're actually trying to cultivate. And that's why I am a proponent, for example, of ungrading. That I do not think that taking a course to get a grade is helping anybody in the end. Because guess what? As soon as you graduate here, nobody is going to care about your grades. Nobody's going to care about your grades. Maybe the first job or something, but like nobody is ever going to ask, oh, you got a 6 in this course. Oh my gosh, sorry, we just can't hire you. This reflects on your character, right? And yet we feel that if we get a 6 or, barely pass or whatever it is, that could ruin our future prospects because we are indoctrinated to think that way because we're very obedient. Remember that slide where I showed the industrial era and the sort of creative era? The virtues that we need to cultivate are very different. And yet we're still grading for the old school industrial era. And so that's a fundamental mismatch. And I think that there has to be a conversation about this. Not an accusation, because when people get accused, they usually reject, refuse, and double down. Right? It's a good way to close down a conversation. But to open up a conversation about what are we actually trying to select for here? Are our current grading mechanisms good enough in selecting for that wide palette of capabilities and virtues? Or are we just training people who might particularly have very good memories, very good recall, visual learners, whatever it is? We are so biased against most of us because most of us don't have all of those virtues together that are being currently selected for to give the high grades. It's a conversation that needs to be had, and to be honest about it, and to be curious. And I think that those are the ways in which we start conversations about changing the metrics.
Talk about change, right? On the slide on reflexivity. I think that's the birth of a newism, right? Reflexivism or something. That's good. Well, the question that I have is more related to robustness as a value that we tend to overemphasize maybe in society, right? So things that last long. The image that I typically have is the Great Pyramids, right? Things that last a long time, we really think that they're valuable. So when we're putting up the values that we've sustained, say from the industrial era, so on and so on and so forth, you're making an argument here that we need to bring them up to discussion, right? And transform them. So the question really is, what do you think is the role of essentialism or perceiving an essence within these values as being?
I'm a pragmatist, personally, which means that not that I'm a relativist, but rather that my question is always, okay, what is the utility for us as a culture, as a community, as ecological beings to have essences, right? So I personally tend not to be much of an essentialist at all, because I think that there's always, well, first of all, I'm a semiotician, and in semiotics, we think that there is a world, but that our way of interpreting the world will always be partial, that there's no way that I can exhaustively know what's going on, or all the different aspects of it. So if that's the case, I can try, certainly, like I can try to understand you better, but I can never know exactly what you're trying to communicate to me, which doesn't need to be a problem as long as we're both trying to communicate with each other, right? But it does mean that there is no essence that I have, that I'm communicating, or that you have that you're communicating, but rather the communication happens as an emergent phenomenon. It arises and passes away. It emerges and it dissipates. Now, for robustness, I think that sustainability oftentimes uses the concept of robustness. For example, I would love it if I had one computer that lasted me 20, 30 years. When the screen got a dent or a crack or whatever, I just pop it out, put a new screen in, and they could melt down or reuse. And everything was interoperable. Cory Doctorow, one of my favorite internet and media theorists, he talks about interoperability. He also coined the very useful phrase, enshittification, and the technology enshittification adoption curve. But that's a different lecture. The point being, robustness is very useful, because if I have a water bottle that I've had for 10 years, when I drink from it, I'm always having all the memories that I had, all the times that I took it to a festival, that my partner had it, that, whatever it is, it is not just a water bottle that I take, use with the contents, which are then infused with plastic and all that, which is a whole other lecture, and then throw it out. Because really recycling, especially of plastic, is a big myth. You can't recycle plastic more than a couple times because it breaks down, and then the plastic seep into your whatever it's carrying even more. So if we want to talk about micro and nanoplastic. So robustness is a very important concept. I have a paper called Designed to Break about planned obsolescence, especially with electronics, where there's chips in all of our electronics that after the warranty ends, they start being slowed down. I don't know if you've seen all the iPhone scandals where you get the update, it slows down your phone, so you have to go out and buy the next one. But this is standard operating procedure for 100 years since the original light bulb scandal, because light bulbs were lasting forever and you never needed to replace it, and so light bulb companies were going out of business. And when the Great Depression hit, they said, okay, we need things to break easier so that people have to buy them so that we can keep the economy going. And this logic is underpinning our entire civilization, that we need to make things as shitty as possible, but high quality enough so that people will buy them. We need to make sure that they will break as soon as tolerable, so that people will throw them in dumps and have to replace them and buy a new one. And this is an anti-robustness thing. And so I'm very into robustness because of these reasons, because we've been duped into thinking that disposability ain't no thing, right? But tell me, does this rub off on our relationships, our sense of self, and our own role in society when every material thing around us is so disposable? Do we feel that we might also be disposable? That the people we love? How do we quarantine that? I don't think it's very easy to do.
Can I get a follow-up? Would you be willing to send me these slides?
Sure. Just send me an email.
Is your email in
Yeah, right there.
on your website?
And I think they're making a video of this.
Yeah, it's being recorded.
So
Like you, not you guys,
yeah,
but
I've consented.
yes. So we'll also have it posted. But yes, yeah, of course. Mm.
So you were saying that the university is a good place to implement all these like measures to make it more sustainable and all of this. My question is, what incentive does the university have to implement any of these things? So I'm thinking of like the fossil fuel ties, for example, like with Shell. Shell is currently working with the ULVA specifically on like many different research projects and funding them at least 1.7 million euros for this kind of research, because yes, you can build up buildings that are more sustainable like in the long term. That I also like have, well, not doubts for its legitimacy, because like, it doesn't actually work well. And when we're dealing with like the present and the timeline that we have is really all that relevant to like prevent an environmental disaster when we're looking at things long term in like 20, 30 years, when the crisis is very much immediately, because this has always been like my concern with like sustainability, like in countries, for example, or implementing different sustainability models, carbon neutral, biodiversity, so on. That's wonderful. If this was in the 1980s, we are not in the 1980s, that was 40 years ago. We are now in 2025, where we see more and more, especially in the global south countries, like the drastic effects of climate change in Africa, for example. So yes, I agree. What kind of benefits does the university have implementing any of these, and is this really kind of like okay, I'll put it like this. Is a more radical approach kind of needed to save the planet in that sense?
Yes,
Yeah.
absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, of course. I mean, we need to use every single tool in the tool belt. Every single tool, no question. And at the same time, divestment campaigns are part of a larger tool belt, because what they allow us to do is delegitimize the greenwashing of these
Yeah.
companies. And so every time a university divests from one of these companies, investors are less likely to further invest in them. So the idea is, what you really need is every university in the Netherlands to simultaneously divest from not just fossil fuels, but Dow, DuPont, like AgChem, big CAFOs, and other organizations that are typically, how do you say, basically like lawbreakers when it comes to environmental regulations. Like you systematically say, we will no longer do business with you. You are persona non grata. You are the tobacco industry. And then you get major shifts. Then you have oxygen in the room, breathing room for all these upstart wind companies that want to build ships that are solar electric paneled, solar paneled sails that have zero fossil fuels embedded in them for shipping. And you create more investment opportunity for all the other great entrepreneurial companies that have been pushed down by the fact that we are subsidizing in this country alone, just direct costs, 40+ billion euros a year fossil fuels. That doesn't include hundreds of billions in costs to help the environment, etc., that are indirect costs. So, yes, one university doing it by itself, it's better than nothing. All universities coming together and saying we're going to do this, then you actually get change. And imagine what happens if world news, all Dutch public universities divest from fossil fuels in this grand gesture. Germany, France, Belgium, Europe, it starts falling. New Zealand, Australia, the dominoes start falling because this house of cards is held up by social contracts, by trust, by good reputation. I'm an expert on this thing called social license. All these companies that have not been good stewards of our non-renewable resources, thus I don't think they'd be very good stewards of our renewable ones, which they're trying to get all their fingers on. They operate only because governments give them subsidies, governments give them political cover, governments give them carte blanche. The moment that we, the people, say, no, we're not going to do this anymore, we're going to have a carbon tax, we're going to take away the subsidy, we're going to stop all the tax loopholes that allow your company to pay virtually nothing for the actual costs that you're causing, that changes the overtone window of entrepreneurship, of regulation, and of possibility. And you're going to get a lot more companies doing really cool creative stuff that's biomimetic, that's working with new materials, and it's not just going to be like a few big oligopolies controlling our energy systems. And that's just our energy systems. There's other systems too that operate on similar principles. So it's a ratchet effect. And we're going to see all of this sooner or later. And what I'm arguing is it's way better for all of our interests if it happens sooner. Even for these fossil fuel companies and their children. That's like the ironic aspect about it, or the sort of tragic aspect of it. You want to just follow up, and then you can...
Yeah, I kind of wanted to answer, I guess, that like sooner or later, indeed, it will happen. I guess that the incentive the university has, eventually will come, because eventually material conditions will be so fucked that they have to do something, But indeed, I feel like through, collective action and through pressuring, in different poles, outside the institution, within the institution, inside of a classroom, I do think you can accelerate the shift in paradigm so that we don't need the world to be on fire before we realize that maybe, we should have taken care of water or something.
It's a very doomer's perspective, an accelerationist perspective to say, oh, we just need to make things so bad that everybody acts. Because by the time we get to that point, we won't be able to act in an intelligent way. So that's why degrowth, for example, I think is a very boring but rational discourse, because it says, look, we sooner or later are going to have this confrontation with tipping points. We're going to have to either voluntarily reduce our waste, or we're going to be forced to